So welcome to your 1920s video. This video is going to be a little bit different because we're going to cover the 1920s as a whole instead of breaking up into different little topics like we normally do. And this is actually giving you the background information that you need for your upcoming project that you'll find out. So you're going to have to take notes on this. You may have a quiz randomly here or there. I'm not saying you're having one tomorrow, but I want to make sure that you guys have this information down and that you actually understand it accordingly. So we're going to be covering a lot of different topics, so bear with me, guys. Don't give up, and let's get started. Now, World War I produces a different world. You had women and African Americans that joined the workforce for the first time, but when the war ended, that also meant that the opportunities for women and African Americans ended as well. The returning veterans basically assumed that they were going to get their jobs back. In northern industrial cities, African American workers vied with returning soldiers for jobs and housing, and this kind of culminated in race riots. During the hot summer of 1919, race riots erupted in cities throughout the country. The worst was probably in Chicago, and it was triggered by the drowning of a young black man by whites, and the riots continued on for 13 days. A couple years later, in 1921, violence erupted again in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when armed African American men, many of them were returning veterans, tried to protect a young black man from being lynched. And by the time that the Tulsa race riot was over, you had at least 10 whites and 26 African Americans that were dead. In one African American neighborhood, white rioters burned down 35 city blocks to the ground. And this was, again, because of the tensions between the returning soldiers, seeing that the world has changed a little bit, and so they just kind of wanted things to go back to normal, and they wanted their jobs and they wanted their place in society, and didn't appreciate the opportunities that were given to African American men while they were fighting in World War I. Now, World War I also produces an unstable international order, because we know that with the Treaty of Versailles, this creates a strong desire for revenge in Germany. And we know that in Russia, you now have communism, and this widespread fear of communists and radicals leads Americans to question their own political and economic role in the world. So the communist ideology calls for an international workers' revolution to basically get rid of capitalism, which is what America is founded on. And the revolutionary activity that was going on abroad, coupled with a couple of strikes that were happening in the U.S., prompts people, Americans, prompts the first American Red Scare. So basically, Americans had a fear of suspected communists and radicals thought to be plotting revolution within the U.S. They were scared that all of a sudden the U.S. is going to become a communist nation like Russia. And you did have some things happening in the U.S. that kind of gave substance to the Red Scare. You had bombs that were mailed to important industrialists and government officials, including Attorney General Palmer, which we'll talk about in a second with the Palmer raids. And you had suspected anarchists, and an anarchist is someone who's basically against all forms of government, that would mail these bombs, and these bombs were exploding in cities throughout America. So Attorney General Palmer mounted a broad offensive against radicals in the U.S. between 1919 and 1920, and he leads a series of raids in early 1920 known as the Palmer raids, in which police arrested thousands of people, some who were radicals, but mostly they were simply immigrants from southern Eastern Europe. Most of them were never tried or charged for a crime, and the government ends up deporting hundreds of radicals, not because they actually sent the bombs or they did anything, but for the simple fact that they were either known anarchists or they were from an area where communism existed, and they thought that they were spreading those ideas here in the U.S. If you're looking at these two cartoons up on top, you kind of have the idea like Bolshevism. Remember the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution? How it's pulling down America, and America's trying to reach for solid ground. Or how, first you have strikes, and then you have riots, and then you have Bolshevism and murders and chaos, and then what? So the Red Scare was something that was pretty widespread in the U.S. And the fear of communists then led the government to enact the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. Because many anarchists were immigrants, discrimination against immigrants increased. To many, the actions seemed to attack the liberties that Americans held dear. I mean, it should be someone's right to be an anarchist if they chose to, as long as they're not actually harming anyone. And so a group of people in New York City formed the group called the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which still exists today. In 1920 to protect these liberties. And the ACLU tried to do this by becoming involved in important court cases. And to this end, it became involved in one of the most controversial court cases in American history, and that is the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. So here we go. So Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants and known anarchists. And as we said, an anarchist is someone who seeks to basically overthrow or get rid of all forms of government. So Sacco and Vanzetti were charged with shooting and killing 2 men during a holdup at a shoe factory right outside of Boston. And the eyewitnesses of this robbery said that the robbers looked Italian. And so Sacco and Vanzetti are arrested and they're charged with the crime. And even though the ACLU provided defense counsel, the men in a very quick trial were found guilty, and they were sentenced to death, even though there was little evidence actually against them. And most people now say that the convictions against them were not because they actually did the crime, but simply because of their ethnicity and their political beliefs. Nevertheless, on August 23rd, 1927, the 2 men were put to death via the electric chair. And at its worst, the hysteria accompanied by violence characterized the Red Scare. Mobs attacked suspected radicals, abused immigrants, committed crimes, all in the name of justice. But eventually, this great fear of communism would kind of end when people started to realize that democracy and capitalism was more powerful than what was going on in Russia. And by the end of the summer of 1920, the Red Scare hysteria had kind of run its course. We also know now that Sacco and Vanzetti most likely did not commit the robbery and murder, but nevertheless they were still sentenced and killed for this crime. Immigration restriction was also an attempt to turn back the clock on what many people saw as a simpler and better time. So the original Klan, which we know formed in the South or during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, largely to terrorize African Americans who sought the right to vote. And although this new Klan that was arising promoted the hatred of African Americans, it also aimed at Jews, Catholics, and immigrants. So in the wake of all this unrest that's going on with the Red Scare and everything, the Klan sought to monopolize on this because, again, it's anti-immigrants, and since the Red Scare and people were already scared of immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, they kind of sought to monopolize on this. And at the height of the Klan, of the KKK, it had approximately 4 to 5 million members. And this is in the 1920s, and you can see the march of this parade that they're having in Washington, D.C. They boycotted businesses that were owned by anyone who's Jewish, Catholic, or African American, and they would terrorize citizens at night, most often burning crosses outside their home. That was kind of their thing. Individuals as well as organizations like the NAACP, which we talked about with W.B. Du Bois a while back, battled against the Klan and its values because they embraced diversity. And by the late 1920s, the Klan had a series of misfortunes within some of the people that were running it. There was some corruption going on. Some people got arrested. And it kind of started to wither in its importance. It never fully disappeared, but it kind of started to die down in its importance a little bit. But the mid-1920s was the peak of the KKK. Another issue that was going on during the 1920s was prohibition, and we've talked about this a little bit. So we know that prohibition was the banning of alcohol abuse, and we know that the temperance reformers had, been on a crusade to get rid of alcohol since the early 1800s. By 1917, 75% of Americans were living in dry counties that had banned liquor anyways. And then when World War I started, people thought it was unpatriotic to use the corn, the wheat, and the barley, which those are ingredients used in liquor, when they thought that they could use those ingredients to make bread for the soldiers overseas. So that's really what prompted the 18th Amendment to be passed. So prohibition does not stop Americans from drinking, but it did prevent them from purchasing drinks legally. People made alcohol in homemade stills and they smuggled it from other countries. Bootleggers sold illegal alcohol to consumers. In cities, you had secret drinking establishments known as speakeasies. And they actually called it speakeasies because the bartenders would tell the people, the customers, to speak easy to keep it down because they didn't want to get caught. The speakeasies were kind of in the back of like stores or in the, the back of someone's house or something like that so that they couldn't get caught. Government agencies worked tirelessly to repeal or to stop the flow of illegal liquor, but they were shorthanded and the demand for alcohol was just too great. There was millions of dollars to be made by both organized and unorganized criminals. And especially in cities, they realized that liquor was just it was just a part of life. And so they rationalized their actions, the politicians and the policemen, by saying that if people wanted to drink, they would drink. Now you have the gangster like Al Capone, who was a Chicago gang leader, was probably the most famous criminal during the Prohibition era. And Capone's other businesses included prostitution, drugs, robbery, and murder. So Prohibition really contributed to the growth of organized crime in America. By the 1920s, most city politicians were begging for the repeal of the 18th Amendment. And finally, in 1933, you have the 21st Amendment that's passed, which officially repeals Prohibition. Now, with all these different changes going on, and just, sorry, to go back a little bit, why did Prohibition fail? Here you go. You have moonshine, which is illegal liquor, which we just said. Bootleggers are smuggling in. The speakeasies, you had illegal bars that were popping up anyways. And then you had organized crime that was at an all-time high because of this illegal activity that was going on. So Americans are seeking for things to kind of get back to normal. You have the war, you have these race riots going on, prohibitions going on, and they're seeking, to be normal, to go back to being normal. And you have a presidential election. So we're talking about 1920, an election is going on, and Woodrow Wilson is hoping that another Democrat gets elected. And the complete opposite happens. You have Republican Warren Harding, which is this lovely man over here, gets elected to become president, and he campaigns to basically go back to a simpler time before Wilson took office in 1913. So Harding wins in a landslide. Republicans also win control of the Congress, and Americans basically rejected Wilson's ideas of the League of Nations, which was, one of the things that Wilson absolutely pushed for. And he also rejected the idea of being, a world leader. So people wanted basically to go back to normal and to have a simpler time, I guess you could say. In 1920, the U.S. was an economic giant. So it was the richest and most industrialized country in the world. And the United States was also now the largest creditor nation in the world, meaning that other countries owed the U.S. more money than the U.S. owed them. So the World War I basically shifted the economic center of the world from London to New York City. The 1920s also saw what's called the Consumer Revolution, in which a flood of new and affordable goods became available to the public. So because you now have electricity, thanks to Thomas Edison, it supports this consumer revolution. You have electric washing machines and vacuum cleaners and irons, which made housekeeping easier and less time consuming. And it also helps. The accessible electricity also contributes to radio and refrigeration sales. The growing ad industry also plays a part. So magazine and newspaper ads were focused on the desires and the fears of Americans more than what they actually needed. So people who didn't have enough cash ready to buy what they wanted could buy on something called credits. And basically you would put down a small payment, like a small down payment, and then pay the rest of the debt in a regular monthly payment, which allows Americans to now buy products that they may otherwise had to have saved up for years in order to buy. So let's say you wanted to buy, a new refrigerator or a new vacuum cleaner, and it costs $100 and you only have $30. You're going to put those $30 down, and then you'll pay the rest of the money off in small installments throughout the year, month by month. So it allows the average American to start buying some things that were really reserved for only the upper class, and it allows them to kind of partake in a new consumer revolution. Consumers were not only buying these electric washing machines and vacuum cleaners, but they were also participating in the stock market. So during the 1920s, the stock market was enjoying a very profitable period of time. It was known as a bull market. So a bull market is a period of rising stock prices, and more Americans would put their money into stocks in an effort to get rich quick. By 1929, 4 million normal everyday Americans owned stock. Now, how does the stock market actually work? And you can see it here. So let's say we're buying 100 shares of this company called Westclox, and it's $5 per share. So 100 times 5 is $500. That's how much money you are putting in. So the market's doing really well, this company's doing really well. All of a sudden, it's no longer $5 per share, it's now $20 per share. So you're talking that now if you're still buying 100 shares, or if you still have your 100 shares, it's now worth $2,000. So if you take your $2,000 and you subtract your initial investment, which was the money that you put in originally, you made $1,500 clear, just for you. That's the amount of money that you made simply from buying stocks in this company, and this company did well. Now let's pretend that you buy 100 shares of stock in this company again, still $5, and instead of the company doing really, really well, the company starts to fail, and the stock decreases to $1 per share. So 100 times 1 is $100, and if you take what your value of the stock is, which is $100 now, and you subtract your initial investment, which was $500, you're now in the hole for $400. You lost $400. Now, why is this such a bad thing? The reason why this eventually ends up leading to the stock market crash, which happens in 1929, is because people were doing something called buying on margin, And buying on margin is basically just another way of saying that they were buying on credit. So they were purchasing stock on margin, and they would put down 10% of the stock price to a broker. And then the buyer would end up paying the broker the rest of the stock over a period of months. And then the broker would basically hold the stock as a collateral. So if you couldn't pay them back, they just take the stock for themselves so they wouldn't lose money. As long as the price of the stocks rose, the buyer had no trouble to pay off the loan and still make a profit. But if the price fell, the buyer still had to pay off the loan. And the buyers would gamble because you never really knew if a stock was going to go up or if a stock was going to go down. So when you're buying on margin, let's say you don't have the $500 available. You're only going to put down, let's just say $100, and you're borrowing the other $400. Now, if your stock increases to $20 per share, you could pay off the $400 that you borrowed easily because you have $1,500 in a profit. But let's say that your stock decreases to $1. You now owe that money, and you don't have that money from anywhere. So it was really a risk, and it was really a gamble for the average Americans to participate in the stock market. If we're going back a little bit to politics now, you have something that's known as the Teapot Dome scandal. So Teapot Dome is an actual place in Wyoming. In the early 20th century, they found oil in this one spot called Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and they also found oil in a place called Elks Hill, California. And the government buys this land, and it goes all the way back to 1912. President William Taft, remember the guy that was really fat that got stuck in the bathtub? So William Taft decides that the government's going to own this land, and they're putting it aside for the Navy Department. So the oil that's on this land is for use for the United States Navy. Now, fast forward to 1921, you have a new president, which we know is Harding. And Harding gives the job of Secretary of the Interior to a man by the name of Albert Fall. You can see the picture over there to the left. So Albert Fall asks the president, President Harding, to sign this land of Teapot Dome, Wyoming and Elks Hills, California, from the Navy Department to the Interior Department. And President Harding does just that. Signs the land over from the Navy into the Interior Department. And once the land is in the Interior Department, Secretary Albert Fall takes this land that has oil on here and he leases the property to private oil companies in exchange for bribes. So the companies that would give him the most amount of money basically were the companies that had access to this land. Eventually in 1924, rumors of what's going on pops up and the Senate leads an investigation and the oil reserves get returned back to the Navy. Albert Fall ends up going to prison for a year. And this becomes known as a Teapot Dome scandal. So basically, a Teapot Dome scandal is when you have the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, take this land that was supposed to be reserved for the Navy and gives it to oil companies for the highest bidding, basically. Now, President Harding dies in 1923. He dies of a heart attack. And the VP, Calvin Coolidge, becomes president. And Calvin Coolidge is the one that kind of oversees the Senate investigation. And Albert Fall does go to prison for a year. Now, something else that's happening, here is a Let's Think of the oil scandal. This is a very popular political cartoon. So just take a look at it and think about the questions on the side. Here we go. Now, something else that was happening in the government was America still trying to figure out its role in the world. And basically, the U.S. foreign policy in the 1920s was shaped by the reaction to World War I. No previous war had been as deadly as World War I, and all nations in the world basically agreed, World War I can never happen again. But how are you going to prevent this goal from ever being achieved? Like, how are you going to prevent another war from actually ever happening? And two things come out. So you have this idea of to avoid an arms race. So basically, you have the world leaders gather in this Washington Naval Disarmament Conference in Washington, D.C., and between 1921 and 1922, world leaders agreed to limit the construction of large warships, and they hammered out a settlement on several issues between Japan and the West. So basically, they were just trying to keep control of the amount of warships and weapons that were being created, and they were trying to keep that number reduced. You also had the attempt to prevent war, and this was done through the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. So basically, this is done by our Secretary of State, whose name was Frank B. Kellogg, and the French Foreign Minister, last name is Briand, and they drew up a treaty to outlaw war as an instrument of national policy. So basically, it made war illegal. But this pact was unenforceable, and everybody knew it. I mean, how do you actually make war illegal? What are the repercussions or what are the consequences for someone who declares war on another country? And those things were never really truly ironed out. So America's solution to all of this was to basically isolate themselves from everything and to keep the world at an arm's length. So whatever's going on in the world, it doesn't impact the U.S. Let's just kind of isolate ourselves and ignore everything else and let them deal with their issues if it pops up. Now, money issues was another matter. the U.S. insisted that Britain and France repay back their loans from the war to the U.S. because the U.S. had been giving Britain and France money in order for them to actually keep fighting World War I. Now, in order for Britain and France to pay back the loans to the U.S., Germany had to pay back Britain and France the reparation payments that, they talked about in the Treaty of Versailles. So in 1924, an agreement known as the Dawes Plan was arranged for the U.S. to loan money to Germany so that Germany could make their war payments to Britain and France so that Britain and France could take the money from Germany and give it back to the U.S. That's what the Dawes Plan basically says. After the stock market crash of 1929, the U.S. runs out of money, which means that Germany stops making payments, which means that Britain and France also stop making payments. And in the end, the war debt situation damages America's reputation more than anything else because people in the world thought it was heartless for American bankers and politicians to insist that England and France repay back their war debts without really thinking about how many human lives were actually lost in World War I. And this is something that America actually listens to. And in the next war, when we talk about World War II, America is a little bit more flexible in terms of collecting their war loans. They weren't so demanding as they were during World War I. So it was definitely a lesson learned. That's why it's important for you guys to know your history. Now let's shift a little bit. Another major trial that happens in the 1920s is known as the Scopes Trial or the Monkey Trial, it's also called. So in 1920, you had, for the first time, more people living in urban areas than in rural regions. And this split between urban and rural America was not just, split geographically, but it was also split, socially and culturally. The groups were divided in every single way possible. Urban Americans were enjoying the new consumer products that we talked about, and they were enjoying the leisurely activities, which we'll get into in a moment. And they were generally more open to social change and to new discoveries that were popping up in science. They tried to emphasize science over traditional values or traditional ideas about religion. Now, in contrast, rural Americans did not participate fully in the consumer bonanzas that were actually happening, and they missed out on the new forms of leisure. They were just living a different life, which means that they were more traditional in their views of religion and science and culture. Now, the rural and urban Americans also differed in terms of formal education. So in rural America, farmers expected their children to know the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that was basically it because they had to do farm work. In urban America, formal education took on more importance. And by 1930, you had more American teens that were graduating from high school and going to college than ever before. But fundamentalism emphasized Protestant teachings, and it was the belief that every word in the Bible was the literal truth. Fundamentalists believed that the answer to every important moral or scientific question was in the Bible, and their ideas took root all over the country, but they were really strong in rural America. So now you have this idea of two different kinds of countries: rural country and then the urban country. And this comes to a head in the Scopes Trial, or like I said, it's also called the Monkey Trial. So the issue was the theory of evolution. Now, developed by the English scientist Charles Darwin, and I know that we've spoken about Darwinism before. So Charles Darwin believes that complex life, like human beings, developed gradually from simpler forms of life. So we basically have a theory of evolution coming from other animals or organisms, however you want to put it. Now, this theory clashes directly with the idea of creationism in the Bible. So it goes against fundamentalism. In 1925, in the great state of Tennessee, they decide to make it illegal to teach the Charles Darwin theory in public schools. So the ACLU, remember this group that we talked about for the Sacco and Vanzetti trial? The ACLU convinces a high school biology teacher named John Scopes. This is why it's called the Scopes trial, to challenge this law. And they basically convinced Scopes to teach evolution in his classroom. And the second that he does it, I mean, the class is over and they're arresting him. And so the Scopes trial then draws this national attention. And this is what the ACLU wanted. They wanted to bring attention. And journalists are flocking to Dayton, Tennessee. Dayton was the city or the town that this was occurring. Because it was the idea that, could human beings actually descend from monkeys? So you had Clarence Darrow. He was the most celebrated defense attorney in America. He travels from his home in Chicago to defend Scopes. And then you have the 3-time presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan. So he runs for president 3 times, loses 3 times. But he was an expert that the prosecution was using. So you see this picture here of Darrow and Bryan that are sitting together when they're actually on opposite sides of this trial. But the highlight of this trial comes when Darrow calls Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible. And on the stand, William Jennings Bryan says that the Bible stands for the literal truth. He believes that God created Adam and Eve. And he even says that he accepts the Bible absolutely. Now, Scopes is found guilty of breaking the law. That was never really debated in the trial. He gets found guilty. He is fined $100. And that's basically it. I mean, he doesn't go to jail or anything like that. But the idea was that the Scopes trial was to showcase the major cultural and religious divisions in the U.S. And it starts to raise up questions over things that people had kind of once so greatly believed in. I mean, did we maybe come from monkeys? Is evolution actually true? And so people in urban areas were a little bit more open to this idea of Darwin's theory of evolution. Once the trial was over, each side still believed the truth of their position. They didn't necessarily change sides, but it raised an important conversation that still continues on even today. Now, when you have these different ideas, these different sides in America, that also translates into other things culturally. And part of that is new trends. So in the 1920s, many people consider this to be the first decade of the modern era. And the growth of cities changed how we basically lived our life. So on a farm, people would work from dawn until dusk, with little time to spare. At night, the family may play some games. Maybe they would read, or maybe they would sing around the piano. But that was basically it. Sometimes they would join other other farm families, for picnics or a game of baseball. But they didn't have much time or money to basically do anything else. In the city, it was entirely different. The average work week in all the industries fell from 70 hours in 1850 to 55 hours per week in 1910 to 45 by 1930. And the work week itself also changed from 7 days a week to 6 days a week to 5 days a week. And at the same time as the hours and the work days are decreasing, salaries and wages were increasing. So you now have people that were working less, so they had free time and they had disposable income. And so urban and suburban Americans looked to new sources of entertainment. The motion pictures helped supply that demand. And during the 1920s, you had 60 to 100 million Americans going to the movies every single week. So the movies became a really popular thing. And like the movies, the phonograph and the radio became powerful instruments of mass popular culture. And both of them, were technology advancements that had occurred in the 1800s, but really took hold as people had extra money in their pockets and had extra time on their hands. So millions of radios and phonographs were marketed in the 1920s. And on a deeper level, the phonograph and the radio helped to produce a standardized culture because people all over the country would listen to the same songs. They would learn the same dance. They would all basically know what was popular and what was going on. They were able to do everything, didn't matter if you were on the West Coast or if you were on the East Coast, if you were in the North or the South. It kind of brought people together in a way it never had before. Radios also brought distant events into millions of homes in a way that newspapers or magazines just can't do that. And the phonograph allowed people to listen to music from the radio whenever they wanted to, playing on their little discs. The radios became very popular, and it became a form of spending family time together, because people would gather around the radio in order to listen not only to just music, but they would have talk shows or comedies or mystery shows on here. And so it was kind of, the TV of the day. Let's not forget that the American car was also becoming really popular, and part of the reason why the American car was becoming popular, was not only because of the assembly line making it really cheap, but it was also the idea that now people could buy things on margin or buy things on credit, and so they didn't need the whole amount of money to buy the car. They could put down a little bit and then pay through it month by month. The 1920s was also the age of heroes. So before the 1920s, you really didn't have many famous athletes. But this changed, and the 1920s is actually known as the golden age of sports. So thanks to the increased newspaper readership, because more people are now going to school, so that means that more people are educated, more people could read. And so with more people reading, you had people that were, not only was it the golden age of sports, but it was also known as the golden age of sports writers. So people were turning the athletes into almost like immortal gods through their writing. And so they became incredibly famous. And probably the most famous was the picture here of Babe Ruth. Now, a person could ask, why did athletes reach such heights of popularity during the 1920s? Like, what about the 1920s made something change? And yes, it was the writing and the golden age of the sports writers, but the other part of that answer is that people needed heroes, and they needed to basically have like a role model. World War I had kind of shattered Americans' faith in progress, and it kind of made the world seem flawed and seem cheap, I guess. And these heroes, these athletes, gave people the idea that they could dream and they could have like these crazy lofty dreams. And if they're looking at these heroes, if they're looking at Babe Ruth, maybe they could see themselves in these athletes. And so the sports heroes of the 1920s gave Americans a sense of hope. Now, even the biggest sports heroes could not match the popularity of Charles Lindbergh. So in the 1920s, the airline industry was still a baby. I mean, yes, you did have planes in World War I. You had a couple of domestic airlines that would carry mail and passengers, but airplanes was really, a novel sight to most Americans. It wasn't something that they were very popular with. And so the pilot became a new breed of a hero, like a daredevil who risked his life in every flight because flying was so uncertain. And Charles Lindbergh outdid them all. In May of 1927, he took off from Long Island, New York, in a tiny single-engine plane known as the Spirit of St. Louis, and he flew all the way to Paris, France. Now, this was not the first flight across the Atlantic Ocean, but it was the first time that you had someone fly across the Atlantic Ocean nonstop and solo. And the flight itself took more than 33 hours, and he had to stay awake for the whole 33 hours because, again, he was the only one on the plane. When Lindbergh landed in Paris, he became an instant media celebrity. Now, the 1920s was also a pivotal moment in history for women. So we know that the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. Remember the organizations of NAWSA and the NWP, the National Women's Party? They still exist, and they're still pushing for women to continue breaking down the walls that were up against women and continue pushing themselves and, getting out into the work field and all that stuff. And women did take heed, and they did listen to that. During the Victorian age of the late 1800s and early 1900s, women were expected to center their lives around the family and the home. But the new woman of the 1920s was more liberated. So she wore shorter dresses, instead of the dress going all the way down to her ankles, she was now coming out right to her knees, so she was showing some leg, which was very scandalous. She wore more makeup. She would dance to the latest music. She would have social and political opinions to herself. She cut her hair into a short bob. She wore bright red lipstick, smoking and drinking in public. These were all things that women just weren't used to doing, and it seemed crazy or ludicrous for a woman to engage in these activities. And while this was going on, and this was going on very much openly in the public and people could see this, probably one of the biggest things that was going on in women's lives was the fact that women were tending to live longer, so they were now marrying later and they were having fewer children. So it would free up their time to pursue other interests. And that could just mean that they were maybe going out shopping more often, or it could maybe mean that they were actually going to school and participating in nonprofit organizations, or trying to get into politics, or opening up their own businesses. Now, the idea that if you were, a housewife, the new technology, the vacuum cleaners and the irons, that took out some of the time that you would spend in cleaning your home. And so it also freed up time for you to do something with your time. Maybe read a book, maybe join the church or something like that. Now, this was happening to women during the 1920s, yes, but it was particularly happening to women in urban areas. In the rural regions, especially if you're talking about regions that had no access to electricity, the women continued to do household labor that was really intense, maybe even painful. They had to, draw and carry the water from wells. They heated the irons and the stoves. They would wash clothing by hand. So here you go, you have the split between urban and rural America that was pretty distinct. You also have the idea of fads coming up in the 1920s. So fad is an activity or a fashion that's short for very popular for a short period of time. So something like the mood ring or MC Hammer pants. Fads were really popular in the 1920s. Dance marathons or flagpole sitting, and I'll show you guys a quick video clip of flagpole sitting. But this also became very popular amongst the youngsters, and it also prompted women to kind of be a little bit more free in their lives than they had before. Now, African Americans also started to break free in the 1920s, and you had a new prominent African American leader emerge by the name of Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica, and he traveled around the world before finally landing in Harlem in 1916. And from his travels, Garvey kind of came to one important conclusion: that blacks were exploited everywhere. Not just in the US, but kind of everywhere. So to counter this problem, he promoted the idea of universal black nationalism, and he organized a Back to Africa movement. So unlike the other African American leaders during the time period, like Booker T. Washington, which we talked about, or W.B. Du Bois, Garvey didn't call for black and whites to work together to improve America. Instead, Garvey advocated for the entire separation of the races. By the mid-1920s, his Universal Negro Improvement Association boasted a membership of 2.5 million people. And his advocacy of black pride and black support of black-run businesses won support from across the country. But his movement starts to fall apart in the second half of the 1920s because the federal government sends him to prison for mail fraud, and then after he's released from prison, he gets deported back to Jamaica. And without his leadership, the Universal Negro Improvement Association kind of loses its focus and basically dies off. But even though Garvey's movement dies off, his ideas don't necessarily fade, because the idea of being a separatist or a nationalist basically gives way to like the Black Power movement in the 1960s. So it dies off, but his ideas kind of remain and really take hold when we're talking about the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. Now, something else that African Americans also participated in is known as the Jazz Age. So, a man by the name of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and this name should be somewhat known to you because he's the author of the book The Great Gatsby. He's the one that gives the 1920s the term the Jazz Age. And African Americans really gave, are the ones that really put jazz on the map. So jazz is a musical form of improvisation. It's not like you can actually read sheet music to it. You just kind of feel it and go with it. And it combines music from African American blues and ragtime and European-based popular music. So it takes something from a little bit of everything. And it starts in New Orleans. That's where it kind of starts and grows. And it spreads throughout the country with people that play it in bars or in lounges. Trumpet player Louis Armstrong, which is a picture here, becomes kind of the unofficial ambassador of jazz. Jazz was more than just a musical style. It was a symbol for the Roaring Twenties. It's a part of the Prohibition era. You're playing it at the speakeasies. You're playing it at the nightclubs in New York and in Chicago, St. Louis, LA. In one particular famous club known as the Cotton Club, and the Cotton Club is located in Harlem, you had African Americans playing African American music to all white audiences. And the phonograph records that people would buy and the radio would spread the influence of jazz throughout the country and even into Europe. Jazz was the way that it kind of made the U.S. a land of shared cultures and traditions, and it was a place where people came together. So jazz was a way of bridging the races, and it also brought in new forms of dancing. And again, just kind of like rock and rolled in the 1950s, where older Americans thought that it was a bad influence on the youngsters. It was the same thing with jazz. Old Americans thought that jazz music was a bad influence on the nation's youth, and they didn't want them to actually listen to it. Now, the final thing that we're going to be talking about in today's video is the Harlem Renaissance. So jazz and blues were expressions of the African American experience. The pain of the African American experience could be heard in the blues, the sad songs. But the joy of the experience of African Americans could be heard in the soaring notes of jazz. In the 1920s, African Americans were also starting to express themselves in other ways, not just in music. And you had the creation of lots of different art popping up, and not art just, in paintings, but novelists and poets. And they were celebrating the African American culture, and they were exploring questions of race in America. So this flowering of African American culture became known as the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance really gives a new vocabulary and a certain dynamic conversation about race relations in the U.S. In the 1920s, the term New Negro enters the American vocabulary, and it suggests a radical break with the past. No longer are African Americans just going to kind of silently endure discrimination and exploitation. They're going to stand up and say something, and them standing up and saying something was taking place. It started off in Harlem, but eventually it spreads. And they were taking the pains and the joys of being black in America, and they were literally leaving behind a legacy that spoke to Americans of all times. The Harlem Renaissance gave a voice to African American culture, just like jazz and blues gave it a tune. African Americans, or this was a way for white Americans to view the African American culture, to appreciate it, but this was also a way for African Americans to view themselves. And the Harlem Renaissance eventually ends with the crash of the stock market in 1929. But it gives a sense of a group identity that didn't exist before. And it really starts to set the bedrock that would later become the civil rights movement. So the 1920s was a decade of many highs. It was a decade of prosperity. And it was kind of like everybody's super duper happy and doing their thing and buying lots of things. And even though the government had some issues here and there, they were just kind of chillax, doing their own thing, letting people do their own thing. And it was really a decade of wealth, prosperity, And you had incredible things coming out with jazz and the Harlem Renaissance that kind of leads into the big stock market crash of 1929 and eventually into the Great Depression of the 1930s. So I know that we talked a lot. I know there's a ton of things here, guys. But I hope that you've gotten this all down. And if you have any questions, obviously let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys tomorrow in class.